By December 1944, the Allies believed victory in Europe was near. Paris had been liberated. American and British forces had pushed across France and Belgium, driving the Wehrmacht back toward Germany's western border. Morale was high. Soldiers spoke of being home by spring, but in the forests of the Ardennes, Adolf Hitler planned his final gamble. The plan was codenamed Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. Hitler believed that by striking through the Ardennes, he could split the Allied front, drive to the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the west. It was a desperate stroke, born from the illusion that lightning could strike twice in the same forest. 4 years earlier, in 1940, German armor had surprised France through these same woods. Now, in the winter of 1944, Hitler hoped to do it again. The Allies, meanwhile, had grown complacent. The Ardennes were considered a quiet sector, thinly defended by American divisions resting from months of combat. The dense woods and poor roads were thought impassable for major armored operations, especially in winter. Intelligence reports hinting at a buildup were dismissed. Commanders expected local counterattacks, not a full-scale offensive. At dawn on December 16, 1944, that illusion shattered. 2,000 German artillery guns opened fire along an 80-mile front. Under a blizzard sky, tanks of the 5th and 6th Panzer Armies thundered west. Villages vanished beneath fire and snow. Entire American units were overwhelmed or forced to retreat. Chaos spread through the lines. In the center of this storm lay the small Belgian town of Bastogne, a modest crossroads town of about 4,000 civilians. Its location was its curse. 7 major roads converged there, leading to every sector of the Ardennes. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the movement of men, tanks, and supplies in the heart of the German advance. When the German spearheads broke through the American front, Bastogne suddenly became vital. If it fell quickly, German armor could roll west unimpeded toward the Meuse River. But if it held, even for days, it could choke the momentum of the entire offensive. The American command realized this almost immediately. General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group issued orders to hold Bastogne at all costs. The closest available force capable of rapid movement was the 101st Airborne Division, then resting near Reims after brutal fighting in the Netherlands. Within hours, the 101st received orders to move. Trucks roared through the night, headlights dimmed, engines echoing through the frozen French countryside. Men of the 501st, 502nd, and 506th Parachute Infantry Regiments were loaded without winter gear, with limited ammunition, and with the understanding that they were heading toward another frontline crisis. By December 18th, the 101st began arriving in Bastogne, a division exhausted but unbroken. They were joined by elements of the 10th Armored Division, sent ahead to delay the German armor until the paratroopers could dig in. The roads were clogged with retreating units and civilian refugees. The 101st moved in the opposite direction, toward the sound of guns. Command of the defense fell to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the division's artillery commander, who assumed acting command while Major General Maxwell D. Taylor was away at a staff conference. McAuliffe, calm and methodical, was respected by his men, a leader whose restraint concealed a stubborn steel beneath. By December 19th, the German noose began to tighten. Columns of the 2nd Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr moved from the north and east. Volksgrenadier divisions pressed from the south. Bastogne became the hinge on which the entire battle might turn. To the Americans, it meant survival. To the Germans, it meant breakthrough. As the paratroopers dug trenches in the frozen earth, the snow thickened. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Ammunition was rationed. The wounded were carried to cellars that doubled as hospitals. From the woods came the distant roar of tanks and the whine of incoming shells. By December 20th, Bastogne was nearly surrounded. The last roads west were severed. American artillery batteries fired until their barrels glowed red, then fell silent for lack of shells. The siege had begun. Inside the encirclement, McAuliffe's men prepared for the long hold. They did not yet know that Patton's Third Army, far to the south, had already begun to turn its entire front to reach them. The crossroads of Bastogne had become the beating heart of the Battle of the Bulge, and in that frozen heart, the 101st Airborne prepared to make its stand, outnumbered, outgunned, but unyielding. When the 101st Airborne Division reached Bastogne, it entered not a battlefield but a trap already closing. Snow muted the sound of war, but the thunder of German artillery soon made the silence a memory. Columns of Sherman tanks from the 10th Armored Division rolled through the town, their tracks grinding frozen cobblestones. Infantrymen filed into the forests, ringing Bastogne, digging shallow foxholes that filled with ice before the first night ended. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe took stock of his situation. Acting as division commander in Major General Maxwell D. Taylor's absence, McAuliffe inherited a division of roughly 11,000 men, paratroopers, glider infantry, and support units. They were reinforced by fragments of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, engineers, artillerymen, and medical staff. Collectively, they represented one of the toughest, most mobile fighting forces in the U.S. Army. Yet they had arrived with almost no winter clothing, few heavy weapons, and a supply line about to vanish entirely. The weather became an enemy of its own. Snow fell constantly, masking troop movements but freezing men in their foxholes. Blankets froze stiff. Canteens became solid blocks of ice. The roads were coated with black ice, making any vehicle movement perilous. Even the wounded sometimes froze to death before medics could reach them. Still, the 101st adapted. Foxholes were lined with blankets, ammo boxes turned into makeshift stoves, and parachute silk from past drops was used as camouflage. McAuliffe established his headquarters in Bastogne proper, inside the Heinz barracks, a stone building whose thick walls offered some protection from shelling. From there, he directed 7 defensive sectors, each controlled by a regimental commander. The 501st PIR under Colonel Howard Johnson to the northeast, the 502nd PIR under Colonel Steve Chapuis to the northwest, the 506th PIR under Colonel Robert Sink covering the west and southwest approaches, and other units filling the gaps, including the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment and armored elements from the 10th Armored Division. To the Germans, Bastogne appeared stubborn, too stubborn. The German 26th Volksgrenadier Division and elements of Panzer Lehr attempted to encircle the town fully by December 21st. The American perimeter shrank, but it held. Every hill, every hedgerow, every farmhouse became a strong point. Tanks and anti-tank guns were hidden under camouflage nets, waiting for the next assault. Communication with higher headquarters grew thin. Radios failed in the cold and lines were cut by artillery. Air support was impossible. The skies remained gray, heavy with snow and fog. The 101st was effectively on its own, surrounded by at least 6 German divisions totaling over 40,000 men. Despite this, McAuliffe refused to consider retreat. He understood the crossroads' strategic importance. If Bastogne fell, the German 5th Panzer Army could drive west, split the Allied front, and seize the fuel depots along the Meuse River. Every hour Bastogne held bought time for reinforcements to regroup. His orders were simple: hold the town at all costs. Meanwhile, more than 100 kilometers to the south, General George S. Patton studied the unfolding crisis. Commanding the U.S. Third Army, Patton had already been preparing an attack eastward into Germany. Now, with the German breakthrough threatening the Allied front, he made one of the most dramatic maneuvers of the war, a full 90-degree turn north. In just 48 hours, 3 corps of his army pivoted to march toward Bastogne, a logistical feat almost unimaginable in such weather. By December 22nd, the German encirclement was complete. Bastogne was cut off from all sides. Inside, food rations dropped to half, then a third. Medical supplies dwindled. Shells for artillery were counted individually. The town's hospital overflowed into basements and churches, where Belgian civilians worked beside medics under candlelight. The air stank of smoke, sweat, and antiseptic. It was on that same day that a German delegation arrived under a white flag, carrying an ultimatum demanding surrender. McAuliffe's reply, brief, cold, and immortal, would echo around the world. But that moment of defiance was not just bravado. It reflected a command decision rooted in tactical necessity, morale, and pride. For now, Bastogne remained an island in a sea of steel, isolated, besieged, but unbroken. Each man knew they were surrounded. None of them planned to leave. The siege had reached its second stage, and the human one, where endurance mattered more than numbers, and every foxhole became a personal front line. The defense of Bastogne was not defined only by maps and orders. It was defined by the people trapped inside the ring of snow and fire. Soldiers, medics, civilians, and even prisoners all endured the same cold, the same hunger, and the same relentless shelling. Beneath the strategy lay a human war, fought not just against the enemy but against despair. The men of the 101st Airborne had fought in Normandy and Holland. They had jumped into chaos before, but Bastogne was different. Here there were no jumps, no clear skies, no escape. They were surrounded on the ground, buried beneath the winter itself. In the forests around Foy, Noville, and Bizery, the paratroopers dug into frozen earth with entrenching tools, sometimes breaking them against the hard ground. They lined foxholes with blankets or the bodies of fallen comrades to block the wind. The cold was a living thing. It numbed fingers until triggers felt like stone, froze rifles until they jammed, and turned the breath of every man into clouds of ice. At night, the snow reflected the muzzle flashes of German artillery, painting the woods in orange and white. Many soldiers stopped wearing their helmets because the metal froze against their skin. Cigarettes became a currency, shared, traded, or saved for the rare moments of silence. And yet morale held. The 101st prided itself on never breaking. Every man knew that holding Bastogne meant holding the line for the entire Allied front. Even when surrounded, their spirit remained unbroken, a combination of training, faith in their leaders, and the simple, stubborn refusal to yield. Inside Bastogne, the wounded were everywhere. Every cellar became a hospital. Bandages were torn from bedsheets. Snow was melted for water. When morphine ran out, medics used whiskey, pressure, or prayer. In a makeshift aid station under the town church, candles flickered over dozens of stretchers. The air was thick with smoke and blood. Belgian nurses worked alongside American medics, many of them young enough to be the soldiers' sisters. Civilians brought in what they could: soup, rags, old clothing, knowing it would never be enough. Doctors operated in their coats, hands trembling from cold. Outside, artillery shells shattered the stained glass windows, showering the wounded in colored shards. Still, the medics worked. Their task was endless, thankless, but essential. In the absence of supplies, they improvised. Scalpels were sterilized in fire. Gloves were reused until they tore. When asked how many they had lost, one medic later said, "I stopped counting when I couldn't remember their faces anymore." The medical fight at Bastogne mirrored the larger one. Relentless, without rest, and fought against impossible odds. Before the war, Bastogne had been a quiet market town. Farmers, shopkeepers, children. Now it was a fortress under siege. Hundreds of civilians hid in cellars, basements, and barns. The walls shook constantly. Food vanished. Families lived by candlelight, listening to artillery and waiting for morning to decide if they would live or die. Many civilians risked their lives to help the Americans. They shared bread, offered shelter, and guided lost soldiers through the maze of alleys and fields. Some were killed when their homes were hit by artillery, or when German tanks rolled through the streets. For the paratroopers, these civilians were a reminder of what they were fighting for: ordinary people whose town had become the center of a continent's war. In return, the soldiers protected them fiercely. When German shells struck civilian shelters, troopers dug them out by hand, hauling survivors through smoke and snow. When Christmas approached, the civilians of Bastogne and the soldiers shared what little they had: a crust of bread, a cup of coffee, a moment of humanity amid ruin. There were no proper cemeteries during the siege. The dead, American and German alike, were buried in shallow graves behind the lines, often marked with sticks or helmets. Some bodies were frozen where they fell, becoming part of the landscape. Captured Germans were few but treated with grim efficiency. They were cold, hungry, and terrified, often no different from the men who guarded them. Prisoners were put to work carrying wounded or clearing roads under watchful eyes. For both sides, the enemy became a mirror. Exhausted, young, and lost in a battle neither could fully understand. Death hung over Bastogne like the fog. It became ordinary, stripped of drama. Soldiers stopped reacting to the shells that fell nearby unless they landed directly in their trench. One paratrooper wrote later, "The only sound that scared me was silence, because it meant they were moving closer." Under siege, the 101st became something more than a division. The men depended on each other not only to fight, but to stay sane. They shared every cigarette, every scrap of food, every moment of dark humor. Jokes about frozen coffee or missing socks kept them human. Letters home were short and uncertain. Many were never delivered. But inside their isolation, something rare was born. A sense of belonging that no metal could measure. This bond would carry them through every assault, every shell and every rumor that help was coming. Even when Patton's name reached them through the static of broken radios, they refused to think of themselves as needing rescue. They were the 101st. They didn't need saving. They needed supplies, ammunition, and a target. Their pride was their armor, and it hardened with each passing day. The siege of Bastogne was no longer just a military event. It had become a test of will, human against winter, flesh against steel. And beyond the foxholes, far to the south, an entire army was already moving to break that ring of ice and fire. The next question was not if help would come, but how fast it could reach them through the storm. The siege of Bastogne was not a spontaneous act of courage. It was the result of interlocking decisions, tactical, logistical, and psychological, made by commanders who understood that the fate of the entire Western Front could hinge on a single town. The 101st's refusal to be rescued was born not of arrogance, but of circumstance and calculated resilience. When McAuliffe assumed command of the division, he faced an impossible equation. Too many roads to defend, too few men, and an enemy that outnumbered him nearly 4-1. His genius lay not in bold offensives, but in discipline and calm. He delegated authority to his regimental commanders and trusted them completely. Each sector operated semi-independently, linked by radio when possible, by runners when not. He moved artillery like chess pieces, concentrating limited shells at the most critical points. When ammunition ran low, gunners switched to smaller bursts or direct fire against tanks, an unheard-of tactic for 100mm howitzers. Every round was counted. Every shot had purpose. McAuliffe's tone never changed. Even when reports came of breakthroughs and surrounded platoons, he remained steady. His composure filtered down through the ranks, transforming fear into grim efficiency. Men said later that his voice over the radio sounded like it was coming from a man sitting by a fire with coffee in his hand. It was leadership through calm, not command through volume. And it kept the division together. For the German High Command, Bastogne was a thorn that refused extraction. The encircled town sat directly astride the main supply routes for the 5th Panzer Army. Every truck, tank, and half-track bound for the Meuse had to pass through or around it. The Germans believed the town could be taken quickly. They underestimated the terrain, the weather, and above all, the defenders' resolve. Assaults from multiple directions by the 26th Volksgrenadier, Panzer Lehr, and elements of the 2nd Panzer Division converged on Bastogne throughout December 20th, 25. Each time, they met well-dug paratroopers supported by artillery zeroed in to deadly precision. The forest and fog worked both ways. German armor could not maneuver freely. Narrow roads became kill zones, tanks bogged down in snowdrifts, engines freezing in the night. What was intended to be a lightning thrust became a slow grind. The Germans soon realized that every day Bastogne held delayed their timetable. By the time they concentrated enough force to crush the town, Patton's Third Army was already on the move. When the German offensive began, Patton was south of the Ardennes, preparing to strike into Germany. At a high-level conference in Verdun on December 19th, General Eisenhower asked which commander could relieve Bastogne the fastest. Patton's reply stunned the room. "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. Few believed him. His army was facing east. Turning north meant a complete pivot of supply lines, bridges, and artillery, across snow, ice, and narrow roads filled with retreating units. But Patton's staff, already anticipating such a contingency, had drawn up the plans days earlier. By the time orders were signed, his columns were already on the move. It was one of the most remarkable operational maneuvers of the war. The 4th Armored Division, 26th Infantry Division, and 80th Infantry Division of the 3rd Army began pushing north through the blizzard. Roads vanished beneath snow. Tanks crawled forward at walking speed. Fuel trucks skidded off icy cliffs. But they kept coming, inch by inch, toward Bastogne. Inside the besieged town, no one knew exactly when or where the relief would arrive. Radio contact was sporadic. Rumors spread that Patton's men were days away or hours. But regardless of distance, morale lifted. The 101st didn't see Patton's relief as rescue. They saw it as a link-up, Two forces meeting, not one saving the other. That distinction would become the legend. For the first week of the siege, the weather sealed Bastogne's fate. Thick clouds grounded Allied aircraft, cutting off supply drops and airstrikes. The defenders survived on captured German rations and whatever supplies had been hauled in before the encirclement. Then, on December 23rd, the skies finally cleared. At dawn, the sound of engines filled the air, the droning of C-47 Skytrains from Night Troop Carrier Command. Parachutes blossomed above the town, drifting through the cold sunlight. Crates of ammunition, food, and medical supplies thudded into the snow. It was the first sign that Bastogne was not forgotten. Later that day, P-47 Thunderbolts swept over the forest, strafing German convoys and pounding tanks trapped on icy roads. The effect was immediate. The Luftwaffe, crippled and fuel-starved, could not contest the skies. For the first time in days, the defenders looked up and saw hope, silver wings cutting through the blue. Technology had finally tipped the scales. The town would still suffer, but now it could endure. By the third week of December, both sides knew the fight for Bastogne was symbolic. The Germans called it the Festung, fortress. The Americans called it the Alamo of the Ardennes. News reached the outside world through fragments of intercepted communication, and newspapers soon hailed the 101st as heroes. Inside the perimeter, soldiers heard that Patton was coming. Some joked that they didn't need help. Others simply nodded and reloaded. When the relief finally broke through, McAuliffe's staff later recalled his reaction. Satisfaction, not surprise. His men had never considered surrender. They had done exactly what they were ordered to do, hold until relieved. The myth that they refused rescue began later, born from pride. The 101st did not refuse Patton's help. They simply did not wait for it. Their job was to hold Bastogne, not to be saved. And when the Third Army finally arrived, the men of the 101st greeted them not as saviors, but as brothers arriving late to a battle already won in spirit. As the weather cleared and the German assaults waned, the stage was set for the decisive moment, the confrontation that would seal Bastogne's place in legend, and the exchange of words that would echo across every battlefield to follow. The turning point was coming, the moment when surrender was demanded, and defiance became immortal. The winter sun rose pale and indifferent over Bastogne on December 22, 1944. The snow had hardened overnight into a crust of ice, cracking under each bootstep. Smoke from burning tanks and shattered houses drifted low across the fields, mixing with fog. To the weary men of the 101st Airborne, the landscape looked frozen in both time and fate. They were cut off completely. 7 days of fighting, no clear skies, no reinforcements. But still, the line held. By that morning, the German High Command was convinced that the Americans must be at their breaking point. Fuel and ammunition were scarce. Medical supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. Many soldiers wrapped torn curtains around their boots to keep from freezing. The wounded lay in cellars, tended by overworked medics using whiskey for anesthesia. Rations were stretched to the last crumb, yet morale refused to collapse. To the Germans, this stubbornness was irrational. To the 101st, it was duty. At around 11:30 a.m., a strange silence settled across the lines near the Majoret Road, east of Bastogne. From the fog emerged 4 men, 2 officers and 2 soldiers, carrying a white flag. They advanced carefully, accompanied by a bugler sounding a short, uncertain call. Watching from the foxholes, American troops lifted their rifles, waiting for orders. The German party was escorted blindfolded into the town, to division headquarters at the Heinz barracks. They brought a written message addressed to the U.S. commander of the encircled town of Bastogne. When the note was presented to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, he was initially confused, not by its content but by its tone. The German letter, signed by General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, commander of the XL-7 Panzer Corps, demanded the complete surrender of Bastogne to save unnecessary bloodshed. It stated that the town was surrounded, that resistance was futile, and that a period of 2 hours will be granted to consider the terms. If rejected, the letter warned, a heavy artillery bombardment would follow. The wording was formal, confident, even condescending. McAuliffe read the note once, then again, Around him stood his staff officers, cold, unshaven, and exhausted. The tension in the room was thick, but when McAuliffe finally looked up, he grinned. "Aw, nuts," he said. The officers blinked. "Sir," he shrugged. "They want us to surrender, nuts." A ripple of laughter spread through the command post. It wasn't the laughter of mockery, and it was release. A moment of warmth in a frozen hell. Someone suggested he send that as the official reply. McAuliffe chuckled, then returned to his maps. "No, that's not enough," he said. "We need something more formal." But as they debated what to write, the phrase stuck. Nuts captured everything. Defiance, humor, and contempt rolled into a single word. It was the kind of American slang the Germans couldn't possibly understand, which made it even better. Finally, the message was typed on official stationery and handed back to the waiting officers. To the German commander, nuts. The American commander. The German emissaries were puzzled when the message was translated to them. One asked, "What does this mean, nuts?" The American escort, Colonel Joseph Harper, smiled. "In plain English, it means go to hell." When the emissaries departed, snow began to fall again. Within hours, German artillery opened up around Bastogne. A furious barrage of shells that tore through the frozen ground. Houses collapsed, trees exploded, and the sky turned red with fire. Yet the lines did not break. Paratroopers huddled in their foxholes, shouting over the blasts, "Merry Christmas, you sons of bitches!" It was December 22nd, 2 days before Christmas Eve. In every dugout and barn, soldiers sang carols, traded chocolate bars, and joked that nuts was the shortest war speech ever written. Even as shells rained down, morale soared. The single word had become a banner, a rallying cry that transformed exhaustion into fury and fear into faith. For McAuliffe, the message was more than bravado. He knew the gravity of his decision. The division's situation was desperate. No withdrawal routes, dwindling supplies, wounded piling up by the hour. Yet surrender would betray every man who had died holding those lines. He trusted his troops' endurance. He trusted Patton's advance. And above all, he trusted that history would remember defiance, not surrender. What the world would later call the miracle of Bastogne was, at that moment, nothing more than a choice, a refusal to yield even when reason demanded it. That night, McAuliffe visited the frontline units personally, moving through the snow-covered woods under mortar fire. Soldiers saluted as he passed, some calling him the general who told the Krauts to shove it. He shook hands, offered cigarettes, and told them, "Hold your ground. Help is coming." In his calm, the men found resolve. They were no longer defending just a town. They were defending a statement 4 letters long, echoing through the storm. The next 2 days tested that statement to its limits. German tanks continued to probe the defenses, supported by infantry assaults through the woods. The paratroopers answered with bazookas, mines, and artillery. Every shell counted, every position fought for twice. Then, on December 26th, the rumble of engines came from the south. Scouts from the 4th Armored Division of Patton's 3rd Army reached the village of Ardennes, breaking through the German cordon. By evening, the first tanks rolled into Bastogne. The defenders cheered, though few had the strength to stand. Relief had come, but the town had not been taken and McAuliffe's men had never surrendered. Later, when Eisenhower was briefed on the episode, he laughed aloud. "That's the best damned answer I've ever heard," he said. Patton, upon reading it, simply remarked, "A perfect reply, short, proud, and American." Bastogne would live on as more than a battle. It became a symbol. Nuts wasn't merely defiance against the Germans. It was defiance against despair, against the logic of surrender, against the idea that any force, no matter how overwhelming, could dictate the spirit of free men. In that frozen town, surrounded by steel and silence, McAuliffe had condensed the American character into a single, unforgettable word, December 26, 1944. For 7 endless days, Bastogne had stood alone. The 101st Airborne had endured constant shelling, relentless cold, and repeated assaults from the German XL-7 Panzer Corps. Yet now, faint and distant beneath the icy wind, came a sound that every man in the foxholes had dreamed of hearing, the deep mechanical growl of tank engines. To the exhausted paratroopers, it sounded like salvation. 3 days earlier, while McAuliffe was scrawling nuts on that fateful reply, General George S. Patton had been orchestrating one of the most audacious maneuvers in military history. His Third Army, then positioned more than 100 miles to the south, was ordered to pivot north through ice, snow, and chaos to relieve Bastogne. In just 48 hours, Patton's divisions executed a 90-degree turn in sub-zero conditions, a feat so logistically improbable that Eisenhower's staff initially doubted it could be done. But Patton's discipline and foresight had prepared for exactly such a moment. Weeks before the German offensive began, he had already tasked his corps commanders to plan contingency moves in all directions. When the order came, Patton's response was immediate. "We're ready to drive north. Just give the word." The 4th Armored Division led the advance under Major General Hugh Gaffey, supported by the 26th Infantry and 80th Infantry Divisions. Columns of Sherman tanks, half-tracks, and supply trucks thundered along frozen roads, their engines choking on the cold. Snowdrifts were taller than men. Bridges were blown out. German roadblocks and ambushes littered every mile. Still they moved, day and night. The terrain between Ardennes and Bastogne was a nightmare of narrow roads and dense forest. The Germans had entrenched along key villages, Martelange, Warnock, Bougainville, and each had to be taken house by house, field by field. The 4th Armored Division's Combat Command Reserve, led by Colonel Creighton Abrams, became the tip of the spear. Abrams, a man whose name would one day define a generation of tanks, was calm, direct, and relentless. His orders were simple: break through to Bastogne. Progress was brutal. German anti-tank guns and Panzerfausts lurked behind every hedgerow. Ice-covered roads caused tanks to skid and crash into ditches. Air support was impossible. The skies remained thick with clouds. Soldiers froze at their posts. Mechanics poured gasoline on their engines just to keep them alive. But Patton's army pressed on, driven by his words, "Relieve Bastogne or die trying." By the morning of December 26th, Abrams' column reached the outskirts of Ardennes, a small village just south of Bastogne. German defenders, knowing how close salvation was for the Americans, fought savagely. Tanks exchanged fire across open fields, shells whistling through the falling snow. At 4:50 p.m., Staff Sergeant Oswald T. Ozzie Bell of the 37th Tank Battalion radioed in the message that would echo through Allied lines. "We're in Bastogne." The lead tank, Cobra King, broke through the last German positions, rolling past the smoking ruins of Ardennes and into the southern edge of the town. Men of the 101st Airborne cheered from behind sandbags, waving their helmets and rifles. Some cried openly. Others simply stared, too exhausted to react. The relief column had made it. When Abrams himself arrived a short time later, McAuliffe greeted him with a grin. "You're late." It was a joke, of course, but one born of pride. Bastogne had not fallen. Far to the south, Patton received word of the breakthrough in his headquarters near Luxembourg City. When told Bastogne had been relieved, he removed his gloves, looked at his staff, and said quietly, "Well, gentlemen, that's some Christmas present." Patton's daring maneuver would go down as one of the most remarkable logistical operations of the war. In just 3 days, his army had disengaged from battle, reoriented its entire front, and advanced more than 100 miles through freezing weather and heavy resistance. The relief of Bastogne didn't end the Battle of the Bulge, far from it. The fighting continued for weeks as the Allies pushed the Germans back toward the Rhine, but Bastogne became the turning point. It shattered the myth of German invincibility and demonstrated the power of Allied coordination and resolve. In early January 1945, Patton finally met McAuliffe and the officers of the 101st Airborne. He praised them for their defense but couldn't resist his trademark sarcasm. "You 101st sons of bitches are the reason my men had to fight through hell," he said. McAuliffe smiled. "Next time, we'll let you have the glory first." It was a moment of mutual respect. The fiery armored commander and the calm paratroop general, bound by a single victory. Yet even then, a quiet debate began to stir among historians and soldiers alike. The relief of Bastogne had been achieved. The siege was broken. But the 101st Airborne had never surrendered, never withdrawn, never requested rescue. When reporters later referred to them as rescued by Patton's army, many within the 101st bristled. Their reply was simple and unshakable. "We didn't need rescuing. We held Bastogne," that sentiment, born in frost, forged in defiance, would become legend. When the tanks of Patton's Third Army rumbled into Bastogne on December 26, 1944, the battle-scarred paratroopers of the 101st Airborne didn't celebrate like men rescued. They greeted their armored comrades with nods and quiet relief, but behind those frozen smiles lay exhaustion so deep it was almost invisible. The siege had lasted 7 relentless days. The town that once held 4,000 civilians was now a skeleton of ruins, its streets buried beneath shell fragments, twisted iron, and the frozen remains of men and animals alike. The smoke of burning buildings drifted endlessly into the white sky, and the air smelled of fuel, cordite, and death. When medical teams entered the town, they found hospitals overflowing. The 20th Armored Infantry Battalion recorded hundreds of wounded packed into cellars, many with untreated frostbite and gangrene. Supplies were almost gone. A single chocolate bar might be shared by 5 men. A single bandage washed and reused a dozen times. It was victory, but victory with a terrible price. The 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division and other attached units, had suffered nearly 3,000 casualties during the defense of Bastogne. Many of these came from frostbite, exposure, and exhaustion rather than direct combat. Temperatures during the siege often plunged to 20°, 4° at night. Helmets froze to the ground, weapons malfunctioned. Even canteens were blocks of ice. The men who held the perimeter around Bastogne, from Foy to Marvy, Hemrula to Nefe, had fought not just the enemy but nature itself. In those same days, the German 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel lost thousands of its best soldiers and vehicles. The attempt to crush Bastogne had drained its fuel, ammunition, and momentum, all of which the German army could no longer replace. As one captured German officer reportedly admitted, Bastogne was the stone in our boot. For the people of Bastogne, the battle was no less brutal. Caught between artillery and street fighting, hundreds of civilians hid in basements with little food or heat. Entire families shivered in the dark as shells tore through their homes. Some emerged only when the relief column arrived, pale, starving, and trembling from shock. American medics shared their rations and treated civilians alongside soldiers. The paratroopers remembered one Belgian woman who had stayed in town, cooking what little food she had for wounded men in a shattered cafe. To them, she became a quiet symbol of courage. The bond between the soldiers and the townspeople endured long after the war. Bastogne would forever carry the memory of those who fought and those who endured beside them. While the defense of Bastogne had been a tactical victory, its real importance was strategic and psychological. The German offensive, the Ardennes counteroffensive, or what the Allies would call the Battle of the Bulge, began unraveling. Hitler's plan had relied on speed and surprise, to drive through the Ardennes, capture Antwerp, and split the Allied front in two. But Bastogne sat directly astride the critical road network needed for that advance. By holding it, the 101st Airborne and supporting units had effectively blocked the German spearhead. Every day they held delayed the German timetable, forcing von Manteuffel and Sepp Dietrich's armies to waste precious time and resources trying to dislodge them. By the time Patton's forces arrived, the larger offensive had already lost momentum. Fuel shortages, constant Allied counterattacks, and the return of clear skies, allowing U.S. air power to dominate again, doomed the German gamble. The road to Antwerp remained closed. The Bulge, once swelling toward victory, began to collapse. When the siege was officially lifted, reporters poured into Bastogne. They found soldiers too tired to speak, some too numb to even smile for photographs. But the legend had already spread. McAuliffe's single-word reply, "nuts," was now printed in newspapers. Across the world, Eisenhower called the defense of Bastogne the greatest example of American courage under fire. Patton called it the gutsiest, damned stand of the war. For the men who had fought there, the praise felt distant. They didn't see themselves as heroes and then only survivors. One paratrooper wrote home, "They say we're the heroes of Bastogne. Maybe. But all I remember is the cold, the shells, and the friends we left in the snow." Yet their stand had changed the course of the war in Western Europe. Bastogne became the symbol of Allied endurance, the place where the advance of Hitler's last great offensive finally broke. But survival came with a shadow. The men who lived through Bastogne would carry that week for the rest of their lives, and in the days that followed, as the snow thawed and the dead were gathered from the woods, the true scale of that shadow began to emerge. In the days following the relief of Bastogne, snow continued to fall. It softened the wreckage, covering tank husks, shattered walls, and the bodies that still lay half-buried along the tree lines. The guns had fallen mostly silent, but the echoes of the siege lingered in the hearts of those who had survived it. The men of the 101st Airborne were not the same soldiers who had arrived in Belgium 2 weeks earlier. They had entered the Ardennes as elite paratroopers, hardened by Normandy and Holland. They left Bastogne as something else, not just fighters, but symbols. After the relief, military doctors began documenting cases of combat exhaustion among the defenders. Men trembled uncontrollably, unable to sleep even when warmth and safety returned. Some could not speak for days. Others wept quietly in their bunks. In letters home, their tone was different now than stripped of bravado. One sergeant wrote, "We've seen too much. It's not the fighting that breaks you. It's the silence afterward, when you realize you're still alive, and others aren't." The 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, positioned along Bastogne's southern edge, had suffered nearly 40% casualties. Entire platoons had been reduced to a handful of men, yet none had broken. None had fled. That endurance came at a cost measured not only in lives but in the quiet weight carried afterward, a weight that no medal could ease. By January 1945, the name Bastogne had entered Allied mythology. Newspapers and radio broadcasts portrayed it as the defining stand of American courage in the war's final winter. Photographs of snow-caked paratroopers grinning beside Patton's tanks filled the front pages. But the legend that took hold, of a division that refused to be rescued, came from the soldiers themselves. When journalists asked them about Patton's arrival, they repeated the same phrase with dry humor. "We didn't need rescuing. We were fine before he got here." It wasn't arrogance, and it was pride. Pride that they had held when logic said they couldn't. Pride that they had proven something fundamental about the spirit of a fighting man under impossible conditions. Even Patton, never one to share credit easily, acknowledged their grit. "Those bastards didn't know they were supposed to be licked," he wrote in his diary. That's what makes heroes. Bastogne's defense had far-reaching consequences beyond morale. The delay it forced upon the German 5th Panzer Army disrupted the synchronization of Hitler's entire Ardennes offensive. The longer Bastogne held, the more time the Allies had to regroup, redirect armor, and prepare counteroffensives. By January 8, 1945, German forces began withdrawing from their westernmost positions. Within weeks, the Bulge was flattened. The failed offensive cost the German army over 100,000 casualties, including many of its last reserves of tanks, fuel, and experienced troops. The Wehrmacht would never again launch a major offensive in the West. In a sense, Bastogne marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, the moment when the tide, once again, turned irreversibly against them. When spring finally came, the 101st moved east toward Germany, chasing the retreating Wehrmacht through the Rhineland. But the name Bastogne followed them wherever they went. It appeared on division banners, on medals, on the lips of every new recruit who wanted to prove he could measure up to the men who had held that frozen town. Years later, veterans would reunite there. They would walk again through the rebuilt streets, stop beside the Martyrs' Memorial, and look out across the quiet fields that once roared with fire. Some laid flowers. Others stood in silence. To them, Bastogne wasn't about glory. It was about endurance, the proof that courage could exist without comfort, and victory without rescue. In military academies and leadership courses, the Battle of Bastogne became a case study in morale, logistics, and command under isolation. But beyond the doctrine, it carried a moral weight, a testament to what soldiers could achieve when there was no one left to rely on but themselves. McAuliffe, reflecting years later, said quietly, "It wasn't my word that held Bastogne. It was theirs, the men in the foxholes." The 101st Airborne's refusal to see themselves as rescued wasn't defiance toward Patton. It was gratitude expressed through pride. They had endured the storm and emerged standing. In their eyes, Bastogne had not been saved. It had been defended. The story of Bastogne would forever bind the names Patton and the 101st Airborne together in history. But the difference between rescue and relief, between endurance and deliverance, is what gives the legend its power. Because in the end, the men who stood their ground in the frozen hell of Bastogne didn't just defend a crossroads, they defined the meaning of resolve. The Battle of Bastogne was more than a siege. It was a test of endurance in its purest form. In the heart of that frozen Belgian town, surrounded by superior forces, the 101st Airborne Division proved that resilience can hold where strength alone cannot. For 7 days they faced hunger, frost, and fear. They fought not just for ground, but for meaning. The belief that even when abandoned by circumstance, a soldier's duty remains unbroken. When the German demand for surrender arrived, McAuliffe's single word, nuts, wasn't just defiance. It was a declaration that the human spirit, once committed, cannot be besieged. History often remembers Patton's armor slicing through snow to reach the town, and rightfully so. His maneuver was a masterpiece of command. But what makes Bastogne eternal isn't merely the relief, it's the refusal. The quiet conviction of cold, hungry men who chose to stand when every rational instinct said to yield. That choice transformed the 101st from paratroopers into a legend. Their endurance became a mirror for humanity itself. That stubborn refusal to bow even when surrounded by darkness. Today, Bastogne stands rebuilt, its scars softened by time. Tourists walk the cobblestone streets where shells once fell. At the Martesson Memorial, the names of the fallen curve around stone walls under open sky, an unspoken echo of that winter's vow. We held. In the end, the 101st's answer to history's question, why they refused to be rescued, lies not in pride or rivalry, but in principle. They refused because they believed rescue was never the point. Holding Bastogne was the mission. Their defiance did not shout. It endured. And from that endurance, a truth emerged that still defines the legacy of the Second World War. That victory is not measured by who comes to save you, but by whether you can stand long enough for them to arrive. Bastogne was not merely held by soldiers. It was held by the idea that freedom, once encircled, must always find a way to hold its ground.